Okay, folks, so I've got a 2018 Nissan Titan with only 44,000 miles on it. And due to the nature of the direct injection engine on these vehicles, I am experiencing the carbon buildup on the intake valves, which direct injection engines are known for due to their design. So today I'm going to be taking you through what I am doing to alleviate this, including the walnut shell blasting of the intake valves, as well as the exact setup I'm using, where I got the parts from, the adapters, and also in a separate video I'm going to be showing you the installation of the catch canisters to help alleviate this in the future. And the reason I'm doing all this is I purchased this truck with 9,000 miles on it. And by the time it had only 44,000 miles on it, I was experiencing a significant loss in acceleration. Most of my mid-range acceleration was gone. If I wanted to accelerate on the freeway, I just had to floor it and slam it into higher RPMs to get the truck to really accelerate decently. And I knew from driving it that it was just not accelerating at all like it was when I first purchased the truck. So after doing some research, I found out that these trucks have issues with the carbon buildup on the intake valves due to direct injection, which I was not aware of when I first purchased this vehicle. And unfortunately, a lot of vehicles today on the road used direct injection. So I wanted to share with you what I'm doing to alleviate this. And if you want to do this in your garage at home, it's not difficult. You don't need to be an advanced mechanic to do this. Just take your time, and I'm going to walk you through the steps of how you go through cleaning the intake valves on your truck. So here's some of the tools that you're going to need to remove the intake manifold and gain access to the engine block. You're going to want a 8mm socket, which is going to be used to remove the bolts on your throttle body. A 10mm socket, which is going to be used to remove the bolts on the intake manifold itself that hold it to the engine block. You're going to need a 19mm socket on the end of a long handle ratchet, and what that is going to be used for is you're going to put that on the flywheel on the front of the engine, because for each of the cylinders that you clean, you're going to have to turn that cylinder to top dead center. So you're going to need a wrench on the end of that. Small socket, and if you've got a 90-degree Milwaukee, these things are great. You don't have to have one of these for the job, but it makes it a lot easier. I want a couple of extensions to reach the bolts around the intake manifold, a pair of duckbill pliers to squeeze the clamps on your vacuum hoses and remove those. You're going to want a zip tie, and I'll show you what that's for here in a minute. You're also going to want if you've got one, it's great, but a magnet on the end of a pole. These are going to be used to reach the bolts at the aft end of your intake manifold. It makes it a lot easier than trying to reach those by hand. You're also going to want some 2-inch wide tape to cover up each of the holes on your engine block where your intake tracks are. Setup I'm using for the actual walnut blasting. I've got a 20-pound abrasive blaster I picked up from Harbor Freight for about 79 bucks. Got about a 25-pound box of walnut shell media in fine. You definitely want to use fine grit. You do not want to use the coarse grit. It will get clogged up in the lines. So the pieces that I'm using here, this extension wand comes from fcpeuro.com, and this adapter piece I purchased off of eBay, and it's made by a gentleman who actually makes a lot of these for different makes and models of cars. Looks like he's 3D prints these, and again, I'll leave a link in the description. But the piece of the extension wand, again, comes from fcpeuro.com, and you can Google search it. It's a vacuum blaster adapter for the BMW N54, N55. This was about $13. The vacuum adapter that your shop vac will attach to was about $30 off of eBay, and that you can do a search on eBay for that. It is an intake valve carbon cleaner, and it's going to be for the Nissan VK56 VD engine, which is what our Nissan Titan, the second generation Nissan Titan engines have in them. And it's made by a guy, J. Denton, 1977, on eBay. And again, that was at 30 bucks. And like I said, I'll put that as a link in the description. This piece actually is going to sit into the intake hole on your engine block for each set of valves on your block. And the large hose, the large hole, you're going to hook a shop vac up to. The smaller hole here is what your abrasive blaster is going to fit through. And I've modified the setup that comes original from Harbor Freight. The original abrasive blaster, all it is it uses this extremely short piece right here with this cap screwed onto the end and a very, very short ceramic tip, which is not really conducive for trying to reach down into the intake of the engine block and actually hit the valves. So you add this extension wand onto the end of it, and to do that, and I apologize, I'm trying to hold the camera with one hand and show this to you with the other. This comes from, again, I apologize for the camera angle. This comes from FCP Euro with this small piece on the end. This will not fit, this will not thread onto the Harbor Freight valve. So what you're going to need to do, you're going to basically just take this off, and you are going to put the Harbor Freight piece on, and that will thread on to the ends, and then through that, this actually goes down in here to be able to go all the way down into the engine block and actually spray the walnut shells directly onto the intake valves. Before we get too far along in the video, I want to point out that there's an alternate method to walnut shell blasting that you can try if you're not sure that you want to invest the money into the equipment for that process. This is a chemical cleaning process, and I actually tried this method before buying the walnut blasting equipment, and it actually worked pretty well. I decided to go ahead and do the walnut shell blasting in addition to this, just to take the valves all the way back down to as close to new as possible. However, when I performed the chemical cleaning results, I did get significantly good results, and would be a pretty good alternative if you really don't want to invest all the money into a walnut shell blaster. So, and another reason you may want to do this as well is, and this is through research that I found looking at some other YouTube channels who had performed this job on other types of vehicles, the carbon buildup that might be on your valves, it might not actually be hard buildup carbon. Like mine ended up being, it was more of a kind of a soft, gooey mess on top of the valves. And some of the other YouTube posters suggested using chemical cleaning, because if you try and blast walnuts on top of a soft, gooey mixture, you're going to end up with an absolute mess down inside your intake valves that's going to be hard to clean out. So one method you can do to test this is just take the edge of a 90-degree pick, and you can just gently rake it across the top of your valves. Again, don't do this too hard. You don't want to scratch the valves. But if you find the mixture is pretty soft and gummy, you're going to go ahead and want to remove as much of that with some just intake valve cleaner as possible. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to look at each one of your cylinders, and they're not, some of them are going to be at top dead center at the same time, while others are open. Go ahead and spray your liquid cleaner down into the cylinders where the valves are closed first, and let that sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then there's a couple of different brushes that I used after that point to break up the carbon. I've got a long straight bristle brush that I was able to push down into the intake port and just kind of swirl it around like that. That got it the back side of the valve, actually the side of the valve that is closest to the outside of the engine block. That was able to reach back and get to that side. The side of the valve that is closest to the middle of your engine block, I took this toothbrush and chopped it down, and that was able to reach down in there and reach just over the lip of your engine block and scrub around the rim of the intake valve. Another method that I saw that was actually very effective that another YouTube poster put up is take a bundle of zip ties, zip tie them together, and just jam them down into the hole where your valve is, and just sit there and jam it up and down a bunch of times on top of the valve. And these nylon zip ties, they're not going to damage your valves, but it does a very, very good job of scrubbing and breaking up the carbon deposits. This little curved pick here, I'm not sure how well you can see it in the picture, I used, and I just took the tip of that and just very, very gently went around the edge of the valve and just loosened up the carbon right at the edge of the valve. Again, don't use a lot of pressure doing this, but just very gently scrape away the carbon around the outside of the valve, because you're going to find that's where a lot of the carbon is built up and really impedes the airflow going down into your cylinder. All right, so I've got my truck pulled into the garage here, and I'm going to show you the components that you're going to need to pull out from the engine bay to gain access to the intake tracks in the engine block to clean the intake valves. And first thing I want to show you here is on the front, because you're going to be standing and leaning over into the engine bay quite a bit for this job, and it's not very easy at all from a step ladder. However, on the front of the Nissan trucks, the way these bumpers are, at least on mine anyway, the steel bumper that's on here is actually pretty strong. And whether they designed it like this by fault or not, I don't know, but it works for me. You can actually stand on this bumper to get up into your truck to work on it. So if you look at the size of the intake grates, those fit your shoe pretty perfect, and you can actually stand straight up on this thing to get up into your engine bay. So that way you don't have a ladder beneath you that's going to slip out from beneath you trying to get up here and do all this work. All right, so the first thing we're going to have to take out of here is the cover for your air filter. You're also going to loosen up this clamp here, this clamp here. You're going to disconnect this electrical connector here. You're going to disconnect this electrical connector here. This hose will get disconnected. This hose will get disconnected. This hose going directly to the intake manifold will get disconnected. You're going to disconnect this breather hose back here and pull that off. Both of those are going to have to be removed to take off your intake manifold. So take this out of here. We're going to loosen that up. And again, I've already loosened the clamps up on this. This piece back here is going to come out of here. Your boot here is going to come off of your throttle body. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to disconnect the throttle body from the intake manifold. There are 4 bolts here, 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 and here attaching the throttle body. And we'll be back in a minute after I've taken those out. Okay, so for the next steps in our removal process, we've got our bolts removed from our throttle body here, and this does not need to get removed from the vehicle for this task. This can just sit off to the side. The other thing you're going to want to disconnect, there's a bracket up here that holds your engine cover on. You're going to want to unbolt that bracket and take that off. And the reason is, when you take this intake manifold off, it's going to tilt up at an angle and slide out. And if that bracket is on, it's going to hit here on the insulation on your firewall and get in the way of being able to slide this out of the engine bay. The next thing you're going to want to take off is this line here attached to the side of your intake manifold. There's a bolt here, and there's another bolt on the side over here. You're just going to want to take that and pull that off to the side over here. Now, I told you to have a zip tie for this project, and the reason is you're going to take a zip tie and wrap it around the neck of this filler cap here, and then around this line here, and that's going to hold this line out of the way, because if you don't, it just keeps flopping back in the way when you're trying to work on the engine bay. So we have our line zip tied off to the side over here, as you can see. And the next step is we're going to take the bolts out that hold your intake manifold onto the engine block itself. There are 5 bolts running down the side of each of your intake manifold. The first one, there's a little piece of foam here, and the first one is hidden up under that little piece of foam straight down in there. And the rest of them just go down the side, and then there's one way at the back there, kind of hidden back there. Again, the same thing on this side. The first one starts at the front, and then they just run down the back. As you can see, I've already gone ahead and loosened these up. And then the one way at the back you got to get to back there. So after your bolts are loosened up, you can go ahead and take those out of the intake manifold before trying to take the manifold out of the engine bay. And that's where this extension magnet comes in handy. The bolts that are way back here at the back, it makes it a lot easier to be able to reach way back there and grab hold of that guy and pull it out of there. So we have our bolts removed from our intake manifold. And the next step that we're going to do here is simply take the manifold, pick it up at an angle, and it's just going to slide straight out from the engine bay. So we now have our intake manifold removed from the engine bay, and as you can see, it now gives you full access to your intake tracks to clean your valves. And you can look down in each one of them, and there are your intake valves in each of the tracks. There's 2 intake valves per intake track. And also, if you ever have a starter go bad on your engine, here's your starter right down here if you ever need to get to your starter. So this is where we're going to take our vacuum adapter, and this little vacuum adapter is going to sit right down on there just like that, and you'll have your shop vac hooked up to one side and your walnut shell blaster wand hooked up to the other side. So as you can see, we have our intake manifold removed from the engine bay. I want to go ahead and point something out while you've got your intake manifold removed. Go ahead and take a look at the seals around the opening ports on your manifold. If any of the seals are cracked or dry or brittle, you're going to want to go ahead and replace those. If your truck has relatively low mileage on it like mine does, you should be fine to go ahead and reuse those seals. If they're still spongy and soft, go ahead and reuse them. If your truck has higher mileage on it, you may want to go ahead and replace those seals at this point in time.
I've gone ahead and taped off each of the intake ports so that as I'm doing the spraying of the walnut shell media, if any comes up into the engine bay, it won't accidentally go into the other cylinders, because your other cylinders are not going to all be on top dead center, so there could be a chance of any extra walnut shell media going down into the area where the pistons are. I've also gone ahead and gotten that long-handled wrench put onto the front of my flywheel, because you're going to have to turn the engine to top dead center for each cylinder as you do the cleaning. When you turn the engine to top dead center, as you're turning the engine, you will turn the engine in a clockwise direction facing the engine. So I've got the Walnut blaster hooked up and filled up. I've got my shop vac hooked up and attached to my adapter, and we are fixing to do some cleaning. Well, I just got finished doing the walnut shell blasting on the intake valves, and I've got this nice ball peen hammer here, and if there's anybody in the West Palm Beach area that wants to come over and take it and just smack me in the balls with it, why don't you come on over, because it'll be a lot less painful than the crap I just went through. As you can see, that this is not a real easy job to do. Taking out the intake manifold and other parts was not hard at all. In fact, that was a piece of cake. The real pain in the butt part of it was just simply leaning over the engine bay for a very long time and having to reconnect and disconnect the vacuum numerous times, and trying to hold the vacuum by yourself and the shell blaster at the same time. If you've got somebody who can hold the vacuum for you and keep that in place while you're operating the blaster unit, that will make things significantly easier. Because when you use that blaster, the way that I found that it works most effectively for cleaning the valves is in short bursts. And it needs to be, the on-off valve, when you open that up, it needs to be opened all the way open or all the way closed. Because you're working with an abrasive material, you don't want to open the trigger valve halfway, because it'll eat away at your shut-off valve. So if you can have somebody hold the vacuum while you operate it in short bursts, that will make things significantly easier. That was one of the issues I was facing today, is trying to juggle holding the vacuum and holding the blasting line and flipping the switch off and on on the blast line by myself, so that made things a bit more difficult. And this job, plan on this job taking you most of the day. I mean, I'm a pretty decent mechanic, and I started at 12 today, and it's now almost 7 o'clock at night. So it's going to take you most of the day to get this done. It's not going to be a quick job like an oil change or something like that. So after the cleaning is done, you want to go through and check your engine bay and make sure you didn't leave anything in the engine bay. And also run your shop vac around in there real well and get any leftover media particles up, because inevitably there will be some that gets blown out of the vacuum opening and into your engine bay. One thing that I want to point out and caution you on that I messed up on the first time I did this job, when I did just a chemical cleaning, make sure you do not leave this wrench attached to your flywheel. I accidentally left that down there attached to my flywheel the last time I did this, and when I went to start the engine up, that was one of the worst sounds I have ever heard starting a car up. Luckily, it just flipped the wrench around and sheared off the end of the extension and didn't do any damage to the engine itself. But so I got lucky there, but make sure you don't forget to take that ratchet off the end of the flywheel. Just to follow up on my setup that I'm using here. Again, this is the 20-pound media blaster from Harbor Freight. I thought I would need a larger unit, but you absolutely do not for doing this engine cleaning job. Again, this is an 8-cylinder engine, and I bought 25 pounds of walnut shell media, and between messing around with it in my driveway, trying to figure out how to use this thing, and then actually doing the cleaning job, I still have quite a bit of walnut shells left over. And you definitely need to read the instructions once you hook this up on how to operate these different valves on this, because there is a certain order that you turn these off and on and use them in. And again, so this is the on-off shut-off valve that I was referring to, that it was kind of difficult to operate today. And again, you either want this all the way open or all the way closed, but you don't want to use this halfway, because that will eat away at the inside of your ball valve. And when you are operating this, from what I've read, the optimum pressure to operate this at is 80 psi. And so so you can see, I've actually got my truck pulled halfway into the garage, and I've got my air line running out here. And so I just went and rented this unit today from Home Depot, because I don't own an air compressor large enough to run this. So this unit they rent worked just fine. It's about 13 cubic feet a minute. I would say that is about what you're going to need to operate that blaster. And again, since I'm working by myself, hell, I just left it in the back of the truck while I'm working today, and it worked just fine like that.
Well, now that you've got the cleaning process done and your engine's put back together, one thing that I want to point out, when you go out and drive your truck after performing this job, you may notice a small increase in performance and acceleration, but maybe not as much as you thought you would have. The engine's computer takes normally a couple hundred miles to fully reset to any changes to the fuel-air mixture. So as you continue to drive, the performance will continue to get better. For me, it took 2 to 3 days of driving until all of a sudden I noticed a significant surge in power that I had not had in my truck in quite some time. So just wanted to point that out, that don't be disappointed when you perform this job and you go out and test drive your truck and you don't have the immediately results that you thought you would have. It will take some time for the truck's computer to reset. So anyway, I hope this video is helpful, and I hope you guys, learned something from it, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks.